very new professor title from the University of Utah, where Tyler's based. So it's 10:30 a.m. there. And yeah, Tyler, over to you. Looking forward to this.
Sorry, the evacuation people are like walking around by my window. They can't see me, so apologies. This is a new one for me. They're telling me to evacuate, but it's a test. So anyways, I'm going to try to get over the beeping sound behind me. Thanks for having me. I deeply regret that I have to do this from Salt Lake City and not from South Africa. But as I was alluding to earlier, let's try this again in like a year and a half. So I want to talk about some work I've been up to for years. And some of you may have seen versions of this, in which case I apologize, but I promise there's new stuff as well. So, and like anything we do, it's not done in isolation. I want to be isolated from the administrative duties that happen here at the museum, but I don't want to be isolated from my colleagues. And a lot of what I'm going to be sharing today comes from sort of years of work with various colleagues across paleontology and archaeology and ecology. And so I do want to acknowledge them before I get going on this. So there's a
Sorry, I'm just muting everyone. Sorry, Tyler, just hold on 1 second. I seem to have muted everyone, including you. Can you unmute yourself?
I'm unmuted now.
There we go.
So there's a long history of research looking at relationships between climate-driven environmental change, terrestrial ecosystems, human evolution, and I count myself among the people who do that kind of work. And a lot of that research is really focused on the arrow going from climate to terrestrial ecosystems to people. But I want to talk a little bit today about that, but also when things might be going in the other direction. When do people become important ecological forces on the landscape? And I'm going to take a deep time perspective on this and focus on something that I want all of you to be focusing on a little bit more as well. And I'll get into that. Let me move my slide here. So just as a bit of context, I like getting into the historical nitty-gritty of the work that we do. And I'm going to be talking about mammal extinctions. And a lot of this starts with Darwin. In the early 1830s, he set out in the Beagle. That's a nice boat there. And he spent a lot of time collecting Pleistocene fossils in Argentina and Uruguay and elsewhere. And they found some really interesting things. Gomphotheres, giant ground sloths, really big llamas, glyptodons. The lower right there is Toxodon, once described as perhaps one of the strangest mammals that ever lived. And what struck Darwin when he's pulling these, getting these fossils and collecting them from South America, is these all belong to really big animals. Those glyptodons on the lower left there, they look like really big armadillos. I mean, they're bigger than the VW Polos that are ever present on the South African streets. Those are big animals, and the large animals of South America today are not bigger than cars. They're relatively few big herbivores around today. And Darwin wrote that it's impossible to reflect without the deepest astonishment on the changed state of this continent. Formerly, it must have swarmed with great monsters, like the southern parts of Africa. What then has exterminated so many living creatures? And looking into some of the literature, the southern parts of Africa includes both South Africa, but also equatorial Africa, is really referring to sub-Saharan Africa. These initial observations, pulling out these extinct Pleistocene megafauna, this was an important step towards revealing what is now widely understood to be a global pattern, which is massive extinctions of large herbivores, the megafauna, over the last 100,000 years or so. And especially in the Americas and Australia, the vast majority of big animals, say bigger than 45 kilos, disappeared over the last 100,000 years. Extinctions were also taking place in Europe and Asia, also Africa, although African losses were less severe than the near complete eradication of megafauna that occurred in the Americas and Australia. So, Africa has long been considered, some people have referred to it as the fortunate anomaly, the continent that escaped being severely affected by extinctions. And statements like that were not so much, referring to Africa as the fortunate anomaly, were not so much based on assessment of the empirical fossil record, so much as the fact that you can go to certain places and take pictures like the one on my screen right here. I mean, it looks like we got springbok, we got ostrich, we got zebras, there's some maybe wildebeest in the back, elephants, giraffes, incredible diversity, all in the same spot. You can't do that anywhere in, say, North America today. We have a big state park down the road, and you can drive to it. And if you're lucky, you'll see a lot of bison, and you might see a pronghorn or two as well. So you'll see like maybe two different big animal species. And this is true today. If we look in the global context, African megafaunal diversity is exceptional. So this map here is showing sort of the number of species, a little heat map there, that are bigger than about 45 kilograms. And you can see from South Africa, hanging around Kruger, going all the way up to East Africa, these bright yellow-white colors, more than 20 plus species of large herbivores. And then you look elsewhere, and it's pretty dismal. And I don't know how many of you in this talk have been to, say, like Nebraska, right around here where my pointer is. Oh, maybe there. Can you see my pointer? Can anyone?
Yes.
Okay. Now I know. Nobody goes on safari in Nebraska because there's nothing to see. It's not a thing. So Africa is exceptional today. I will accept that. But this doesn't mean that things weren't happening in the past. And if we look at certain types of animal species, the present is actually rather boring. Contemporary diversity among mega herbivores, animals more than about 1,000 kilograms. So the big things, and these are the ecosystem engineers like elephants and rhinos and hippos and giraffes. Contemporary diversity is dwarfed by what you might see in the Pliocene and early Pleistocene. Some fossil sites in East Africa, for example, around 4 million years ago, so Aramis, Canopoi, elsewhere, they'll have up to like 5 different proboscidean species living side by side by side by side. And up to a dozen sort of mega herbivores overall, all in the same sort of paleofaunal communities. And that's exceptional. You don't see that anywhere today. At most you might see sort of five-ish co-occurring in the same broader ecosystems. So something is very different about these Pliocene and early Pleistocene ecosystems. Ditto for the carnivorans. If we look at the Eastern African record, for example, if you go to the Pliocene, there are probably about nine big carnivores that are more than 100 kilograms found in Eastern Africa. Versus today, it's lion, and all indications are that something similar is taking place in Southern Africa as well. But we do have a richer Pliocene record from East Africa to draw from. So this includes, things like saber-toothed cats, very large Pachycrocuta, my favorite, Enhydriodon, giant otter, which may have been more terrestrial than contemporary otters. I think that's totally wild and cool, just to imagine a giant otter going after some sable-like antelope here. Also bears, Agriotherium, occurring from North Africa down to South Africa in the Pliocene. So there are bears on the landscape, there are otters, there are the saber-tooths, the big hyenids, big dogs, you name it. And so big species from both the herbivore side of things and the carnivore side of things are not what they used to be in terms of diversity. So something has been going on. And it does make me, wonder, if Darwin thought that Africa was exceptional today, I mean, what would he have said about Pliocene Africa when you just have this incredible richness of mega herbivores and really big carnivores? And I'm going to follow this up with another question. I mean, he asks, what's exterminated so many critters in the context of American extinctions? But what about Africa? Could the loss of Africa's biggest animals reflect a long history of ancient hominin impacts? And there's an increasing body of literature of people saying maybe, or even definitively yes. So let's get this. This is an open question, and this is what I want us to be thinking about a bit more. Could major human impacts on terrestrial ecosystems predate Homo sapiens, before our ancestors even left Africa, or before our species even first evolved? One of the first people to take this seriously was Paul Martin, a paleoecologist, and best known for formulating the Pleistocene overkill hypothesis, which basically suggested that humans dispersed out of Africa across the globe and eradicated all the big megafauna. And so here's this sort of schematic sketch of, say, North American megafauna. Lots of things. Oh, people show up around 10,000 years ago and they all go extinct. In Madagascar, you're seeing a similar phenomenon. In Africa, he pointed to emerging evidence from the Eastern and Southern African fossil record and said, hey, there are a whole lot of sort of Pliocene and early Pleistocene species. And then I think the Acheulean is sort of, something is happening near the end of the Acheulean, and these species are disappearing. And he suggested that Africa did not experience tremendous extinctions at the end of the Pleistocene, 12,000 years ago, because those losses had already happened due to hominin impacts. And his arguments, he was drawing from outdated species lists on sites that were, this paper was published in 1966, sites that were effectively not dated at all in many cases. And we now know the data that went into that are no good. But his observation sparked a brief debate with Louis Leakey, who said, no way, it's climate change. And then things kind of cooled down for a couple of decades. But more recently, here's a handful of papers over the last 20 years or so, including some, in the lower right, published a couple of weeks ago. I've been seeing arguments for ancient hominin impacts, and I mean before Homo sapiens, in terms of extinctions of African fauna. These seem to be on the rise, and if the review requests I get are any indication of it, it's not stopping. There are a lot of papers out there proposing that there is a deep history of human impacts on African fauna in the form of extinctions. And what's really interesting here is, maybe for some of you that's news. Hadn't even been aware of this. A lot of people I talk to are like, what are you talking about? No, they're out there, and these arguments are sort of becoming embedded, gaining traction among ecologists and conservation biologists who are thinking about the conservation in the Anthropocene today. And you're getting some heavy hitters making statements like the first hints of abnormal rates of megafaunal loss appear in the early Pleistocene in Africa, around 2 million years ago, when there was a pronounced reduction in proboscidean diversity. And this is from a very influential paper, and stating as fact, 2 million years ago, hominins have been responsible for driving extinctions. Yet another one, this one published in Science, the imprint of humanity on biodiversity reaches back 2 million years when our ancestors began, in the genus Homo, began to use the large carnivore niche in Africa, and this was associated with a 2/3 decline in the other large carnivores. And this surprises me because I could literally, you don't get a good sense of the size of my office, but I could fill my office with papers on megafaunal extinctions over the last 100,000 years. I mean, it's a vigorous debate, a lot of data, a lot of people, a lot of disciplines represented in this, from paleoclimatology to archaeology, paleontology, ecology, paleoecology, you name it. A lot of people are working on this and debating each other and trying to make progress on what's going on. And yet, when it comes to these earlier losses, um, this kind of flew under the radar. There were a couple little bits here and there, and all of a sudden, it's become almost ingrained in the literature as this is something that's happening. And it's not necessarily become ingrained in the kind of literature that archaeologists and paleontologists are always reading, which is interesting. And you know, I'll get back to this later. So how did we get to this point? How do we sort of have this debate that never really happened and emerge in this sort of general consensus that around 2 million years ago, the hominin lineage was responsible for eradicating big herbivores, proboscideans, and big carnivores? And I'll get into that. Now, the preferred scapegoat here, those of you going 2 million years, that's about Homo erectus. And that's when Homo erectus appears in South Africa and East Africa. And there's, you know, it's the arguably, depending on who you talk to, probably the first proper member of the genus Homo. For those who think that Homo habilis is not quite there. But certainly a more human-like body plan when Homo erectus shows up, larger brains, presumably a more human-like life history, technological innovation, a lot of arguments in favor of Homo erectus eating a lot more meat than its predecessors. And so maybe, you know, maybe Homo erectus shows up and it's running the show and increased carnivory in this species in particular is responsible for extinctions. Now, so I want to talk a bit about the data and the arguments that have made in a bit more detail. And one of these comes from my colleague, Kate Lyons. I'm not trying to throw her under the bus. I've collaborated with her on things before. Nearly 20 years ago, she wrote a paper in Evolutionary Ecology Research, really focused on extinctions over the last 100,000 years. And if you get into the weeds of that discussion, there's a section like, hey, what's up with Africa? Why don't we see a lot of extinctions there over the last 100,000 years? And she took a page out of Paul Martin's book and suggested, well, maybe those extinctions had already happened. The things susceptible to hominin impacts had already gone extinct. And she also floated various other ideas. And in this tiny little bit of the discussion, I mean, you really have to read the paper carefully to get there. She makes an observation that in the early Pleistocene, at approximately the time when humans began developing more complex cultures and societies, i.e. Homo erectus, there are 12 species of elephant-like proboscidean in Africa. By the Middle Pleistocene, only 2 remained. So she's giving you, you know, depending where you put your numbers, about 1 million years of hominin environment interaction leading to, you know, decimation of the proboscideans. Others have looked at African data today and said, Africa is interesting in terms of the body mass distributions. This comes from a very highly cited paper by my colleague Felisa Smith at New Mexico. Again, looking at extinctions over the last 100,000 years and also going, hey, what's up with Africa? Why don't we see big extinctions there? And they made, I think, a very compelling case that the extinctions on the global scale in the last 100,000 years were unique in terms of the fact that it's mostly large-bodied critters that are disappearing. And that's unusual for the entire Cenozoic for the last 65 million years. You don't really see any size bias extinctions like that. And that's sort of been a key piece of evidence suggesting that maybe humans had something to do with losses over the last 100,000 years on a global scale. And they dedicated some time to Africa and said, hey, there's something weird about the body mass distribution of African mammals. And I've summarized this in a very simple graph here. The average body of an African species is average body mass. And this broadly tracks for medians as well, but it's something in the ballpark of 50 kilograms prior to the late Pleistocene extinctions. And that's half of what you're seeing in Eurasia, North America, South America. And they say, we hypothesize that the late Pleistocene size distribution in Africa, the notable bit being why are there so many, why is the average species so small, reflects a long history of hominid mammal interaction. And citing a paper that is actually Kate Lyon's previous paper saying Homo erectus showed up and killed all the proboscideans. And finally, then there's the literature about the collapse of carnivore diversity. And that's the arguments here have largely been made by Lars Werdelin, also my collaborator on some of this work, Margaret Lewis, noting, basically making the case that, these are the experts in the African carnivore fossil record for the late Cenozoic. And they have made that observation that I pointed to earlier, that, wow, there's a lot of sort of taxonomic and functional diversity in the Pliocene. And they've been making the case that, well, maybe as the hominid lineage becomes increasingly carnivorous, we have interference competition, they're perhaps more effective at taking large prey, and that means less available for the carnivorans, and they eventually become extinct. And so they attribute the loss of carnivore diversity and functional diversity to encroachment of Homo, especially around 2 million years ago, into the carnivore guild. So those are sort of the main kinds of claims. A lot of people have been saying other things, but they're all generally like that. And so let's dig into the data. So let's look at the first bit. And this part about Homo erectus contributing to the loss of proboscidean diversity is repeated again and again and again, even though it was like this relatively minor bit of a discussion, floating an idea. And ideas are great to float. We all need to do that, but they do need to be tested empirically. And I think in some cases we may have forgotten that a little bit. So here's one thing. African proboscidean diversity has been in decline since the late Miocene. Diversity of proboscideans, so elephants and their and relatives from lots of different families, it peaks in the mid-Miocene, and this is very well documented across the continent, and has been declining thereafter. And so this is just a very simplified figure showing the number of genera of proboscideans across Africa from about 6 million years ago to the last 1 million years. Now, today, there's only one genus remaining, but you go back 100,000 years ago, there are two. But the point is here, this is a long-term decline. There have been losses since Homo erectus, but also a lot of losses before that. And there doesn't seem to be something unique about Homo erectus showing up, and then all of a sudden, we're losing proboscidean diversity. And as a nerd who likes getting into the weeds of some of the literature, this initial claim made by my colleague Kate, she drew from the Evolution of African Mammals, published in 1978, which in 2004, when she published this paper, was still the authoritative source on the African mammal fossil record. You really would have had to have multiple experts in Africa's late Cenozoic fossil record to sort of update the tallies. But a 1978 volume sort of outlining the fossil history of different lineages, that's drawing from a lot of literature from the 40s, 50s, 60s, at a time when a lot of the fossil record wasn't even datable. So besides taxonomic revision since then, there's been a lot of important revisions to our understanding of the chronology of Africa's fossil record. So if we just, drawing from that 1978 volume, Kate said that, in a span of about 1 million years, from the early Pleistocene when Homo erectus shows up, so let's call it 2, to the middle Pleistocene, 780,000 years ago, you're losing, 10 proboscidean species. But given our current understanding of the fossil record, really, it's not 12 species down to 2, it's 4 species down to 2. And the time span, two are persisting until quite recently. Elephas reca, or its descendant, are hanging around probably pretty late. So the magnitude of losses of proboscideans is tremendously overstated, because it's based on, the best data at the time, but now known to be outdated. And again, if we look at the longer term context, this isn't a Homo erectus signal. It's a long-term decline. So I think the data aren't quite there. This is a fun one here. So again, people have made claims that for a long history of hominin-driven mammal extinctions in Africa, because the body mass distribution of African fauna, as of about 100,000 years ago, is like half of what you might see in North America, South America, and Europe and Asia. And we can get into the weeds with their data that they use to make this claim. So I agree with one thing. The body mass distribution of African mammals is unusual. Here we've got a histogram showing the number of species across body size classes, log grams here on the x-axis. Africa is in purple. I've lumped together the Eurasia and Americas data and scaled them all to about the same height. But the important difference is Africa is different than elsewhere, because there is incredible diversity of tiny little shrews. A lot of shrew species, mostly of a single genus, Crocidura, and people keep naming new ones, even now, and splitting others as new molecular data become available. And so what Smith et al. were documenting was not an absence of big species in the African fossil record. It was actually an anomalous number of critters in the like 10 to 30 gram size range. Tiny little things. These are not things that hominins are probably spending a lot of time eating. And if we look at, say, animals bigger than about a kilogram, things that hominins are likely to be eating and potentially impacting in some way, there's nothing going on here. There are no meaningful differences in the body size distribution of African fauna versus those in Eurasias and Americas prior to the extinctions of all of the megafauna. So it's the shrew signal. All right, and what about the collapse of carnivore diversity? Now, again, without question, from the Pliocene to the present, big carnivores in particular have taken a nosedive in terms of their diversity. There used to be a lot more than there are today. But that's not, and that is associated with losses of functional diversity, different ways of being a carnivore. And oops, something is going on here. Let's move this along. Let's look at the data. So what Lars and Margaret did was sort of look at functional traits of the dentition of different carnivore lineages, both past and present, and they ordinated that into some correspondence analysis shown here in this plot on the left, and each dot represents a different species. Off to the left, those are the big felids. You have hypercarnivores to the left, hypocarnivores to the right, and then they quantified, they did various metrics to quantify the functional diversity, sort of the amount of ecological space taken up over different time periods. And if you go back, so if we now look at the graph on the right, the solid line is just tracking the loss of large carnivorans. Note, it looks like there's a big drop off between 2 to 1.5 million years ago and extant, and there is, but there's several time bins actually missing from this plot. But the solid line is showing the loss of species richness. The gray bars are showing the loss of functional diversity. And they say, oh, look, between about 2.5 to 2, there's a big dip, and especially between, say, 2 to extant, there's another big loss of functional diversity. And they think that they make the case that early Homo erectus, is showing up in the carnivore guild and making it really hard for other carnivores to do their thing, and they eventually become extinct. Now, that functional diversity decline, so I've replicated some of their plots here. It actually, if you, again, get into the weeds of the data, the loss of functional diversity. So we can envision functional diversity as these like pink convex hole ellipses that I've drawn, or not ellipses, but little basically convex holes around data points. So in the bottom, we've got 2.5 to 2 million, in the middle, 2 to 1.5, and then the top is extant. And so this is sort of encompassing the functional diversity of big carnivores across Africa. And the functional diversity has declined over time. But what's interesting is that that is entirely due to the loss of 3 different lineages. And Hydriodon down at the bottom, it's a gigantic otter. It has very different teeth. It's functionally quite different from, say, a saber-toothed cat. We lose a genet, shown here in the middle. And at the top, we lose a big civet. But that sort of collapse of carnivore functional diversity, if we think of it in terms of actual species, it is entirely due to these 3 things. That is what they have measured. And it's a loss of 3 different lineages or taxa over more than 1 million years. So it's not like Homo erectus showed up and just wiped everything out immediately and wiped out all kinds of different carnivores. It's really, it's entirely about these 3 lineages. So it's, again, the magnitude of what seems to have happened is perhaps somewhat overstated. And then, I can't tell you why these things disappeared. Eventually everything becomes extinct. But it's been argued that the loss of Enhydriodon, the big otter, is linked to changes in the drainage patterns in paleo lakes and paleo rivers in Eastern Africa that occurred as a consequence of ridification. And that was actually an argument made by Lars and Margaret 20 years ago. So there may even be environmental mechanisms in the loss of functional diversity. So how about some alternative ideas? And we're going to put some ideas out there. First, let's have a look at the mega herbivores. And so I'm going to look at more than just proboscideans, but everybody bigger than about 1,000 kilograms. And that's an important threshold. Ecologically, Norman Owen Smith has written a lot about this. It basically makes you relatively immune to predation, at least today. You become more forage limited and you have outsized impacts on the ecosystems in which you live. So let's look at the ancient hominin impacts hypothesis. I mean, people have been saying that there's at least Homo erectus is responsible for the loss of proboscideans, but what about looking more broadly? Do we see a collapse of mega herbivore diversity after the appearance of Homo erectus, or are we seeing long-term changes, as I demonstrated already with the proboscideans? And perhaps what's going on with mega herbivore diversity is a gradual loss tracking long-term records of environmental change. Now, the best data set available for testing some of these ideas come from Eastern Africa, where you have very rich Miocene, Pliocene, Pleistocene. Oh my, you give a talk 1 million times and see an error in your thing. Miocene, Pliocene, Pleistocene, Holocene, modern. Forgive me for that. I'll need to get around to fixing that. But especially in the Rift Valley, there are more than 100 sites with good fauna lists that we can draw from to begin looking at long-term patterns. And so my colleagues, John Rowan and Andrew Dew, and I did that. We started pulling together the fossil data from Eastern Africa. It's well dated, really rich. Taxonomy is pretty well resolved. And here's sort of the takeaway. The mega herbivores, the things bigger than 1,000 kilograms, have been in decline. Here we have age on the x-axis. The y-axis is the number of mega herbivores. You see them going into negative space. These are actually residuals accounting for changes in overall sampling effort through time. But the takeaway here is there is a long-term decline of mega herbivores, and it begins well before Homo erectus shows up. So each of these dots is a different fossil site. And we've got its age and the relative number of megaherbivores. And we can do some formal sort of breakpoint analyses trying to figure out when that decline really kicks in. And it's broadly at about 4.5 billion, 4 to 4.5 million years ago is when the decline really kicks in. Now Homo erectus shows up at 2 million years. So there's a lot going on here well before Homo erectus shows up. And if we sort of want to array this long-term decline along the hominid timeline, again, if things are kicking in at about 4.5 million years ago, when megaherbivore diversity is beginning its decline, we're dealing with Ardipithecus and perhaps early Australopithecus. And in my view, and with a few exceptions, I haven't got a lot of pushback from this. I would argue that the antiquity of this decline sort of eliminates hominins as a cause, at least for setting it in motion, because the hominins around on the scene are effectively bipedal chimpanzees on some level. I mean, Ardipithecus is around when the megaherbivores begin to disappear, and we're talking about a 4-foot tall frugivorous animal that maybe weighs 40-45 kilograms. And, could it, I don't think anyone is making the case that it is taking down proboscideans or other megaherbivores. And I've illustrated this here like so. It's just sort of outside the realm of plausibility that I saw a little laughy thing. It's weird giving a talk on Zoom. This is kind of a joke, but I'm serious. Ardipithecus is not hunting megaherbivores, big things more than 1,000 kilograms, to a point where it's driving them extinction. And I'd say ditto for Australopithecus. It is no. Now, there's some who might take issue with that. I welcome that, but I'm happy to make that assertion for now. What about the carnivores? Well, again, carnivore diversity was exceptional. If we look in the long-term record, diversity peaks sort of at about 3 to 3.5 million years ago, and has been in steady decline ever since then. And again, that onset of decline is well before Homo erectus. The loss of carnivoran diversity is overlapping with Australopithecus. And once again, I don't think Australopithecus is challenging big cats. Is it driving them off their prey so often that all the big felids, for example, are becoming extinct? I don't think so. Or is it hunting so much other prey so often that there's just nothing left for the big felids to eat? Both of those scenarios seem highly implausible. We have evidence from South Africa that Australopithecus is probably not challenging big cats. It's likely getting eaten by the big cats. So what's going on here? How might we instead think about these longer term processes in Africa? First, I want to point out something. Want to impress upon one thing. African ecosystems in the past, so like the late Pliocene and the early Pleistocene, are very different from those today. Again, we have single fossil assemblages in Eastern Africa with 5 different proboscidean species. And these are different families, so it's not like oversplitting, a single genus or something like that. So here's a picture of, Mount Kilimanjaro from Amboseli National Park. We've got elephants. Imagine a Pliocene ecosystem with not just one proboscidean, but 5 living in the same kind of place. And I should also add, let's not forget various giraffes and cevathirs, multiple kinds of hippos in some cases, big old rhinos, calicotheres, claw-footed calicotheres, totally weird things. They're all there too. And that's very different from the present. And in addition to being, more diverse, there are more megaherbivore species. My colleague Faisal Bibi led some work. Let me advance my slide here, showing that megaherbivores weren't just more diverse, they were also more abundant. in the past. And let me unpack this rainbow of colors here. Each of these plots is showing on the x-axis age in millions of years. The y-axis is an indication of the relative abundance of different individuals across size classes. So these like 5 to 15, 15 to 45, 45 to 135 in kilograms. And if we look at the biggest animals, so we go all the way to the right in those red colors, the biggest things are over time declining in relative abundance compared to small things. And these are truly enormous animals. Ditto for the 3 to 10,000 kilogram body size class. Ditto for the 12 to 36,000, or sorry, 1,200 to 3,600 kilogram body size class, and the sort of 4 to 1,200 kilogram body size class. These are all declining through time. And they are declining as smaller mesoherbivores are becoming more abundant. So what this is telling us is if you go to a Pliocene ecosystem, not only will you see lots of different kinds of megaherbivores, but you're just going to see more of them relative to these smaller things. And they did various statistical analyses of their data and showed that the onset of this decline, the big shift is taking place after about 4.5 million years ago. So it sort of tracks some of the analyses we did. Now here's something important. African elephants today, across sub-Saharan Africa, account for most of the biomass. If we look across a range of different systems, these are data from Gareth Hempson, an ecologist. African elephants tend to make up maybe 10 to 25% of the large herbivore populations, which is quite high. But in terms of the biomass, the metabolic biomass, how much they're actually eating, we're talking more like 60 to 90%. So the majority of food that is being consumed in African ecosystems is feeding elephants today. Now, size means elephant populations are typically limited by food, not predation. I mean, this is the definition of a mega herbivore. There are exceptions, and we've all seen cool pictures of this. And from time to time, a bunch of lions may get together and take out an elephant. And especially in the case of juveniles, that's also possible, although you have to mess with mama elephant at the same time. But for the most part, elephant populations are more limited by the availability of food than predation. Whereas if you're a tiny little thing, if you're a springbok in the wild, food isn't your problem. It's getting eaten. And typically these animals are going to be eaten before they starve to death. So this raises an interesting question. I mean, how do you feed all of these mega herbivores? More species, more of them on the landscape. And even today, the one species we have is eating most of the available food. So let's file that in the back of our brain. I mean, that's important to keep in mind. Another important thing, if you're taking, there's a finite amount of biomass in an ecosystem. Now we have plant biomass, and that supports the herbivore biomass, which in turn supports carnivore biomass. And in a properly behaved trophic pyramid, you have less and less and less moving up the food chain. Now, for a given amount of plant biomass, you can sustain a finite amount of herbivore biomass. Now, if more of the herbivore biomass is allocated to mega herbivores, the really big things, this poses a problem for the carnivores. And the reason is a comparable, well, let me just do a little experiment here. Mega herbivores have slow life history. It takes a long time to grow a new one. And because of this, they have very low annual death rates. They're just, slower. But this means they're not a reliable source of meat. So for example, let's imagine we have 1 million kilograms of elephant biomass. That would equate to about 388 individual animals. It's a lot of biomass, but relatively few individuals. And if we take death rate data, I borrowed it from a paper by David Western, death rate scales as a function of body mass. In a stable population, your birth rate and death rate ought to equal out. So this could also be thought of as annual births. But we're talking about 35 individuals dying in a single year out of 1 million kilograms of elephant. Now, if you have 1 million kilograms of impala, that translates to 25,000 individual animals. And and 9,000 of them dying in a given year. So it's an equivalent amount of biomass. But of course, if you're a carnivore, you have to be eating these things, right? And obviously, 9,000 impalas dying every year is a lot of meat becoming available for consumption on a regular basis. 35 elephants, one every 10 days or so is not. And so again, with all this biomass allocated to animals with slow life histories, how do you feed this exceptional diversity of big carnivorans? Because they can't go killing an elephant every day, or the elephant population would crash and become extinct. I mean, you just can't. You can't kill an elephant a day. Now you can kill lots of impalas in a given day, and their population will be fine. So this is the problem I'm trying to get at here. And importantly, now we know something is happening where there's enough food to feed all these proboscideans, and there must be enough herbivores available for these big carnivores to still be eating. That's very different from today, and that can't be explained by an absence of Homo erectus, right? I mean, if we just think about it this way, there's something fundamentally different about these systems in the Pliocene and early Pleistocene. And an argument that is sort of coming out of this is that something must be going on with primary productivity. We have to have more forage on the landscape to support all these mega herbivores. And yet we still have to support large populations of the meso-herbivores, the smaller things, because that's what the carnivores are likely eating on a regular basis. And primary productivity, this is the rate at which solar energy is converted to plant biomass in a general sense. Now, there's reason to believe this might be the case. This is a global temperature proxy from marine delta 18O stack over the last 5-6 million years. This is a modeled data for CO2, but they're new empirical data which are matching it fairly well. If we go to the Pliocene and late Miocene at a time when there's all these mega herbivores, there's all these big carnivorans, it's warmer on average, and you have higher CO2. That is good. Plants like that a lot. Provided there's enough moisture in the system, you're going to get a lot more productivity. So more plant biomass should mean more herbivore biomass and more carnivore biomass. There are even, in this paper by Faisal and Wan, which I've already cited, they made an attempt to actually quantify primary productivity over the last 10 million years. And this was based on present day relationships between herbivores with different dental traits and productivity. And they extrapolated that into the past. There are some issues with this, which they are well aware of. But by their estimates, primary productivity at about 4.5 million years ago is much higher than it is today, and it begins declining thereafter. And the timing of all of this is, matches the loss of big carnivores. It matches the loss of mega herbivore diversity and mega herbivore abundance. And at least in Eastern Africa, where we have really good terrestrial records, it's broadly tracking the expansion of grassy ecosystems. So these are data from Naomi Levin from Eastern Africa, Paleosol carbonate data, where each data point represents an individual isotope measurement on a Paleosol carbonate that's been converted to percent C4 biomass. And things really kick in, at least in Eastern Africa, at about 4 million years ago, when everything else is happening. And you're going from, in the late Miocene and the Pliocene, we have more wooded, if not forested environments, and an expansion of grassy systems. Now, CO2 decline and grassy ecosystem expansion are causally linked. C4 grasses are much more effective at dealing with relatively low CO2 environments. And all of this stuff kind of, I'm guilty of wiggle matching here, but the expansion of C4 grasses presume decline of primary productivity at the same time, and the loss of mega herbivore abundance and diversity, these are all going hand in hand. We can look further. Most mega herbivores are consuming woody plants, and even if we go to this is based on isotope data primarily, about 75% of the extinct mega herbivores are browsers or mixed feeders. Expansion of grasses is probably bad for that. Hey, what about elephants? Well, elephants for most of their fossil history are grazers. It's only relatively recently that they are eating an important amount of C3 grasses, which isn't, or sorry, C3 shrubs and trees and so on. Carnivores are doing the same thing. They are declining at the same time as all this is happening. Note that many of these saber-tooths, for example, where diversity was particularly high, they're ambush predators associated with wooded environments, which are disappearing. And again, as productivity is going down, there's just less food to be able to sustain incredible diversity of carnivorans or mega herbivores. Could the loss of Africa's biggest animals reflect ancient hominin impacts? Some people think so. And I review papers that are making this case all the time. But I think a reasonable alternative hypothesis here is that this is a consequence of long-term processes, well before Homo erectus, where we have loss of productivity paired with and related to C4 expansion, driving these major extinctions and ecological changes in Africa. But more work needs to be done. How do these non-analog systems function? How do we feed all these animals? Can we come up with better estimates than sort of this back of the envelope math that I've been presenting here? Can we do better than pattern matching? Instead of saying, here's the extinction record, here's the environmental record, and here's the paleoanthropological record, can we come up with a more mechanistic way of testing these hypotheses? And the answer is yes. I just got out of a week-long workshop with colleagues, Andrew Barr, Andrew Dew, my grad student, Alyssa McGrath, developing some food web modeling approaches, which is exciting because we can actually model these Pliocene food webs prior to Homo erectus. And you can tweak them. You can cause environmental changes, alter the availability of grasses relative to trees and shrubs, and see what happens. Or you can introduce a new generalist predator like Homo erectus and see what happens. And this allows us to make predictions about what might happen if the environment is changing, or if a new hominin is on the scene. And then we can compare those predictions to the actual empirical record and see, does the record look more like a hominin impact scenario or more like an environmental change scenario? I would also argue, what about us? What about impacts associated with Homo sapiens? Everyone seems to have, at least in the context of this debate, there's been a lot more attention paid to Homo erectus than the species that we know can cause major impacts on terrestrial ecosystems. And I've argued, I don't want to get into the weeds of that here, that I'm not seeing a lot of evidence of anthropogenic extinctions more recent in time. And lastly, I think, I don't know how much of this was new to all of you, but the debate, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, seems to largely be centered around ecologists, macroecologists, with a couple of us who are more familiar with the African fossil record, and it's happening kind of in isolation. And I think the more people are aware of these questions, I'm not saying get the answer that supports my ideas, but I think we need more people to tackle it. And this is why I'm excited to talk to a audience in South Africa about this, because it's as I noted earlier, in the context of late Pleistocene extinctions, there's a vast literature getting to the bottom of this. And I think it's important to get to the bottom of as well in terms of our understanding of human impacts on African ecosystems and what this means for conservation going forward. But not enough people are dealing with it. It's just a relatively small number of people and a large body of literature, or a growing body of literature produced by people who don't work in Africa. So anyways, that's all I've got for you. I think maybe I've taken up too much time, but thank you for having me. Thanks for listening. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much, Tyler. I really enjoyed that. That was so interesting and so well argued. I'm open to questions. Does anyone want to raise anything with Tyler? Just raise your hand, and you can put your question forward. Anyone?
Oh, I see a question. Oh, and then it went away. How do I find it?
Oh, is it in the chat?
It popped up.
There we go.
Fire and controlled burning.
On fire and controlled burning. There you go.
Yeah, I think this is where, I sort of alluded to at the very end. Instead of starting with Homo erectus and thinking about ancient hominin impacts, let's start like more recently. And fire is such an important way that people today and in the past shape the ecosystems around them. Incredibly relevant in South Africa. Now, in terms of the empirical evidence, I've actually been involved in some papers at a postdoc, working with a colleague of mine whose office is right next to mine, who does paleofire research. And he compiled a bunch of Southern African Holocene fire history data. And there is a possible signal around 2,000 years ago associated with pastoralism and various other changes in human behaviors that may be indicative of anthropogenic fire. It's interesting because you grab all these paleofire records from across South Africa in diverse biomes, in different climate regimes, and we're from the winter rainfall zone, summer rainfall zone, year-round rainfall zone, and you throw them all together, and you don't get a whole lot of signal at all. And then all of a sudden, in the last 2,000 years, all these places, despite the fact that climate is doing different things in all of them, they kind of light up, and you see a lot more fire happening 2,000 years ago. So I think there may be some empirical evidence for that. But a year ago, I graduated a PhD student who worked with me and another colleague who looked at several high-resolution sedimentary records from both the west coast and south coast of South Africa in the Cape, and really got into generating these high-resolution records. And her takeaway is it's all moisture availability that's driving these systems. So I think fire is important. There may be a good pastoralist signal, which is still very recent in the context of what I was talking about. Now, as for hunter-gatherers, they're probably using fire too. I'm just not aware of any empirical evidence really making a compelling case that it's happening. And if anything, burning is usually done in a way that would enhance productivity and create more opportunities for large herbivores, or you wouldn't be doing it. But certainly it's another way that humans are impacting the ecosystems in which they live. So there's a lot about some thoughts on fire. Others?
Cool. Thank you. Any other questions? No? Okay. Oh, wait, there's a question. Tim, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Or maybe I should turn off my camera. Thank you, Tyler. So I'm not a savanna ecologist, but I'm a plant ecologist. One of my colleagues, Tim O'Connor, has been doing some interesting work in Gonorrhea National Park in southeastern Zimbabwe, and he argues that the loss of reeds along the river as a result of flood damage during the different cyclones that have happened over the last 20 years. They've removed the reed beds, and the reed beds would have provided a tremendous amount of forage for the elephants. And because of the removal of reed beds, which I suppose might also happen under extreme drought conditions as well, the elephants have now moved their attention to the woodlands along the riverine banks. And so they certainly do consume grass, and they consume reeds as well as a major component of their diet, especially in the dry season. And so there's also that dynamic of what might happen along along the river, the ribbons where the rivers flow, that might also have an impact on population dynamics. I just wondered what your thoughts were on something like that.
That's really cool, because I wasn't aware of that particular example. But to step back and give the broader, so elephants today generally mixed feeders. They eat a lot of anything. but isotopic evidence, at least for Loxodonta, the same genus of elephants that are around today, for all of its fossil history, it shows a really strong C4 signal, which could actually be from eating things like reeds. And the issue is we haven't really pinned down basically when this transition to something that looks more like what elephants are doing today. Now they're highly variable. They're one of the few species among large herbivores where you can actually detect strong dietary differences across different environments. As an example, wildebeest in different environmental contexts still kind of eats the same thing, but elephants will shift around. But I'm really intrigued by the reed idea because that could be an important source of the C4 dietary signal that you're seeing in Loxodonta, at least extant, well, the genus that is still extant in Africa today for most of its fossil history. That's kind of exciting. I haven't gone that way, and in a proper grazing lawn where wildebeest and zebras are hanging out, Loxodonta, elephants are not going to be able to get a lot of food out of that. Ripping up little bits of grass with their, they'll need large biomass. So that's cool.
Could that also link with the giant otter, right?
Yeah, there's possibly some hydrological things. And now I'm going to like, hey, Paranthropus, what's up with its C4 dietary signal in Eastern Africa, for example? Now, all these other proboscideans, for the most part, Dinotheres, Gomphotheres, they're browsers. They're not spending a lot of time on grass. Yeah, if there are longer term sort of hydrological changes and other things, a loss, if elephants would prefer to eat reeds given the opportunity, that could link into certainly some of the things that have been said about the evolution of hippos, but also extinctions of things like Enhydriodon. Very cool.
Cool. We have another question. Have you considered cosmogenic impacts?
No, I have not. But it's possible. I've actually been involved in some of this literature. Geomagnetic reversals, that sort of thing. We're going from normal polarity, what we have today, to a reverse polarity system. During those transitions, there are potentially high levels of UV radiation hitting the surface. The question would be, is this driving extinctions? There's some literature where people have said, yeah, this could be accounting for extinctions in the past, and we know that's happening regularly. I think it would be so that literature's out there. I will say I've not really thought perhaps hard enough about what the consequences might be. The nice thing is these major polarity reversals are well dated, and it would be there's a challenge of dealing with the fossil record because your observed extinction times are not really necessarily equivalent to the true ones, but one could do some mathematical modeling and actually get at that. But again, maybe not me. Remember my last slide, it was you. Someone else, please. I think I've presented two ideas here. Homo erectus did it. It was about productivity and C4 expansion. There are probably other ideas out there that are worth exploring. We just need to get at it. Otherwise, we sort of concede that any possible debate is over. Homo erectus did it.
There's a comment about elephant activity along the Limpopo River in the Mapungubwe area, where it's noted that woodlands are becoming arid due to too many elephants ringing the trees.
Yeah, I think something the elephants love to do, ring bark those trees and kill them. Could I ask about a follow-up to that? I mean, this is, I guess, related to one of the final questions I posed at the end, but how these ecosystems function. Things like elephants are, ecosystem engineers, and that's one way they do it. I mean, they're ripping up trees, they're ring barking them and killing them, but they are outsized in terms of their impact on things like fire, in terms of nutrient dispersal and movement across the landscape, in terms of even dispersing things like seeds. And so this feeds into this, like, you know, how do things work in a system where you have 5 proboscideans and a whole heap of other mega herbivores living side by side? And how are things today different because of that? I mean, we know elephants are important, but just imagine what it would be like to have all kinds of different things like that. So this may imply on some level that this long-term millions of years decline of proboscideans, other mega herbivores, is going to sort of transform us from a system where herbivores are playing a key role controlling what's going on to maybe one where climate is more important. Obviously, there are exceptions, like the example cited in the chat. You still have elephants doing things, but just one, in any system, just one species.
Okay, I think that's all the questions. Tyler, thank you so much for your time today. It's been great. We will definitely have you back, hopefully in person next time. And yeah, I owe you a bottle of wine when you're back in Cape Town again.
I feel like we're square, but I'll let you owe me that.
Okay, great, yeah. Cool. Okay, thanks so much. Thanks, everyone.
All right, thank you. Thanks for having me. And yes, I do hope to do this again in the not too distant future in person.
Excellent. Cool.
All right. Cheers.
Bye.